Welcome to the Supply Chain Pioneers podcast, where we highlight industry leaders on the forefront of innovation and technology in planning, procurement, and logistics. Hosted by your supply chain pro to know, Ulf Venn.
Marcus Vaughan, co-founder of iluminr. I've been in the risk and resilience space for most of my career. Started in recruitment, very focused in the insurance and the risk space. And those that really stood out, that became, executives, was down to communication skills. When I originally started my career in, the risk consulting space, it was very much around, well, what's the outcome we actually need to achieve? And things like COVID were some of those great light bulb moments for us, where we were watching teams not pick up the plan.
Supply Chain Pioneers is powered by Everstream Analytics. Everstream gives you the predictive insights and analytics to make your supply chain faster, smarter, safer, and leaner. Go to everstream.ai to book your demo today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Supply Chain Pioneers. And with me today, I have Marcus Vaughan, who's a co-founder and chief growth officer of iluminr. Welcome, Marcus.
Hey, Ulf, how are you?
I'm good. So, as always, and as is tradition of this podcast, can you quickly introduce yourself to set the scene?
Absolutely. So, Marcus Vaughan, co-founder of iluminr. We're a resilience capability platform. I've been in the risk and resilience space for most of my career now, as we'll probably dive into a little bit today. Absolutely delighted to be here. I'm based in Australia. That's the accent. Great to be here, Ulf, and look forward to a big discussion.
Yeah, no, it's going to be great. And you're our first Australian guest, actually, which is good.
Go.
Yeah, we actually do have some listeners from Australia, so that's just perfect. Essentially, I'm very happy that we can cover that. But let's go through your journey to where you are now, because I think it really perfectly culminates in your current position. So first of all, you started actually not in risk resilience, but in talent and hiring people. So, and then you moved into risk and insurance.
Absolutely.
What do these two areas have in common? And where are differences, and why did you make that move?
Yeah, that's a good question. So absolutely, I started in, in recruitment, very focused in the insurance and the risk space. Really specialized, funnily enough, in actuaries. So the whole actuarial profession was the niche that I was working with in there. And I think over that period of time, working with a lot of actuaries, like right from chief actuary, chief risk officers, even, right through to the junior end of those candidate pools. I think the big thing that stuck out to me in talking with these organizations about trying to find people and good people, and what was the difference between any old actuary, it was quite a technical profession, and those that really stood out, that became executives, was down to communication skills, which was really interesting. And I think that is like one of those parallels that I've pulled the thread on my entire career, is engagement and being able to articulate the criticality of what you're doing from a risk management perspective to non-technical stakeholders. And so that was probably one of the earlier lessons that I had from that career stage. Obviously, the lesson behind a lot of people needing a succession plan, which they still don't have. That's been something we've moved into, as now I'm obviously focused in the resilience space. But the risk management world, looking from the outside, looking in as a recruiter, I just found it a very a fascinating industry and discipline, and followed my heart eventually into risk consulting, which was the next stage.
Yeah, they're actually, based on feedback from other people that I saw online, you were really known as being a pragmatic and practical advisor with a focus on commercials as well, right? Which is important in risk, right? Because you have to invest enough, but not too much. That's just 100%. The nature of risk. So if risk managers are not pragmatic, who actually is? So I think that's showing your really foundational pragmatic mindset. Why did you take that approach, especially because you were offering insurance at Aon, right? What was the reason for you trying to always be the pragmatic advisor to your customers?
Yeah, I think for me, one thing I've always just naturally been leaning into is problem solving. And for me, it always starts with what's the outcome we need to achieve. And so when I originally started my career in, I guess, the risk consulting space, it was very much around, well, what's the outcome we actually need to achieve by this project that we're taking on? And back then, a lot of it was actually around trying to articulate the risk management strategies that a organization had, typically in the enterprise space, to ensure they could get insurance coverage, at the right price, and they had quite a mature approach. So I guess back then it was very much around what do we need to achieve here? What strategies are actually going to increase that level of risk maturity? And then problem solve to get there. So that was, again, you're always limited with the resources that you have. It was very much, well, let's cut out the stuff that actually is very superfluous and doesn't actually add to that, us achieving that outcome, and really get down to the crux of what's actually going to, I guess, move the needle from that front. And so that gets you, again, as a consultant, gets you hyper focused on solving that problem, which drives, I guess, just having a super pragmatic approach and really, like I said, really just getting focused on solving that problem.
Yeah. And I think overall, you also just tend to be that kind of person, I guess, right? Being very pragmatic, and it probably comes more natural to you as well, and makes it easier. And maybe you have chosen the profession because at heart you're pragmatic. I don't know. Could be.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I'm certainly not a person that will follow a process for process sake. So I don't have a lot of time for that. Don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of process, but it has to lead to an outcome, and it has to lead to something that's better than what it was. And so, I think naturally I don't have a lot of time for things that don't make sense. And if they're not making sense, then you need to watch, not just listen to what people are saying about that, but watching what they do and add to that and make sure it is moving in the right direction to, like I said before, actually just achieving a sensible outcome. We're always operating with limited resources. Like every risk manager and resilience practitioner I talk to around the world, it's like we all have finite resources. We're always fighting for it. It's like, how do we get the most done to achieve that outcome with the limited resources we all have?
Yeah. And in a crisis, your most limited resource is often time, right? Because you have to act fast. So it's a good
100%.
practice to use overall.
100%.
Okay. So now we're getting into the next phase of your career, that is risk logic. And in risk logic, I had the feeling your previous experience came perfectly together because you first were helping talents find the right place, and you essentially helped them develop their career. And then you also worked in risk and insurance. And in risk logic, what you offered was consulting and training. And was there a specific reason that inspired you to do that move?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think the driving force behind joining WristLogic is actually my current co-founder, Josh Shields. So I used to work with Josh when I was back at Aon. He was a partner of mine, as in like WristLogic was a partner of Aon's, and that primary relationship was very much between us two in terms of driving that forward. And Josh and his brother, which was the other co-founder of WristLogic back at the time, Daniel Shields. We naturally had just an initial, how do I say, alignment, I guess, in terms of values, work ethic, an entrepreneurial spirit. And so naturally, we just found a really strong alignment in terms of doing business together, but also just naturally being in love with the discipline of resilience. Like it is something that we all find intrinsically just, very thought-provoking in watching organizations build that capability and prepare for, when risks materialize. And so I guess that you put all those things together and there was just natural alignment. And so we moved from working on other sides of the fence to essentially working in the same business together. And that's, we'll get onto that in a little bit. It's where we started tinkering with technology as well.
Yeah. And but before we talk about this a little bit, well, let's talk about the time at WristLogic, because you've coached a lot of business leaders on risk and resilience at that time, which was pre-COVID essentially. So what were some of the most common themes that came up in these conversations?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one of the most common things that we identified, and this is a little bit about how we got to where we got to with iluminr as well, is this natural understanding and resonance when we talk to leaders about planning being important and more important than plans, and then the criticality of capability. So we would spend a lot of time training up executives and running through, desktop simulations. And, one of those key themes that came out every single time we did it was no crisis is like the last one. And so you do have to train for that critical decision-making, capability essentially. And again, one of those other things that came out every time we go through and run a tabletop simulation exercise was, very rarely would anyone pick up a plan. And so you quite quickly start realizing it really does come down to that capability development element, and making sure that there is muscle memory there around thinking through these, getting the right people in the room, thinking through some basic processes on how to understand a situation, prior to your point before, prioritize the limited resources that you have to focus on the impacts that are really going to matter. And that came up time and time again. And so, I think pre-COVID, there was more of a acceptance around plans being super important. And I think since COVID, we've realized that there's just so many threats that we're facing that the plans very rarely get picked up. And so building on capability within those teams has just become hypercritical.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, I just had to think about this for a second, and I can totally see that you have so much to do now that at the heart you need to just practice the crisis management muscle enough to be resilient and be able to withstand the crisis.
100%. And like if COVID, let's say the next version of COVID rolled through tomorrow, it would be different to the last round of COVID. Now, that's not saying there's not lessons from what we just went through, and there's absolutely a level of capability that's been built. But if you tried to design a 200-page plan around the last round of COVID, it's invariably going to be different to the next round of whatever we go through from a pandemic perspective. And so focus on the capability and that, and keeping people engaged in that.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I inherently believe you're right. But we funnily enough had a podcast a couple of months, 1 month ago, I think actually, where I talked to Rapid Ratings, which is a financial risk management solution. And what one of the co-founders here stated is that if now, because of the economic downturn, if there's a new financial crisis happening right now, he wouldn't be as comfortable in the ability of companies to recover because essentially a whole generation passed since the last financial crisis. So I think we're in a sweet spot of maybe 5 years after COVID, where everybody kind of knows is really good in crisis management, but then maybe it could vanish again, right? So you still need to have continuous training and education is what I want to say, right? Which
100%. I actually totally agree with that as well. And I think this is there does become this, I guess, a complacency that will set in that, hey, we've got that, we've done that long time ago, but ultimately that muscle memory and that capability does fade unless you keep it sharp. It's like, it's like a football team that won the last grand final. Like if they don't train for the 6 months after that, the next game's not going to be as good as that last grand final. Funnily enough, my football team in Australia is facing that right now. But we're not having a great season. But it is exactly the same thing. So keeping teams and management teams and leadership teams on their toes and thinking about these a variety of different threats throughout the year keeps that, I guess, that level of capability up, and that's just, to me, is absolutely critical in maintaining an effective response when game day eventually rolls around.
Yeah. And now let's talk a little bit about game day, because now you're the co-founder of iluminr, which if I describe it loosely, I would say it's a incident mitigation workflow system. So an ability to work on a crisis, but with a big and massive spin, which is because because it helps you develop and train in advance. I think it's a perfect culmination of all your experiences you had in the past. So can you maybe describe how you came to found iluminir and what it really does?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we originally started tinkering with, to your point, and building a critical response platform where people could go in an air-gapped environment and essentially work together and collaborate to, resolve or close out a crisis or an incident. And so that's very much the origins of iluminr. It has evolved over time, and things like COVID were some of those great light bulb moments for us. We were watching teams not pick up the plan, and to a certain extent, not even pick up the technology that they had, whether that be our platform or a BCMS or a GRC, and not really accessing. So we could see that muscle memory wasn't necessarily there. And so that gave us, working with customers, they're also going through this time crunch of, we know we need to practice, we know we need to simulate, but who's got time for a 3-hour tabletop simulation anymore at executive every quarter? Like people's time is vanishing. And so we started pivoting on what we were doing from a event response perspective into, well, how do we build capability? And more importantly, how do we do it in a fashion that fits in with the ridiculous lack of time that we all have at the moment, and also cover the insane amount of number of threats that we now have to start thinking about and build awareness to. And that's where we started focusing not just on critical event response, but that capability development into using micro simulations. And micro simulations, for anyone that hasn't gone through them yet, short, sharp, 30-minute simulated activities. You can get into a calendar on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis. You can focus on an element of response. And you can test, essentially, because you're getting to someone's calendar more often, you can test a variety of different threats and put them under that acute pressure to have a light bulb moment. So that's where the platform has come from. And I guess where we've pivoted and I guess grown and evolved into. And that's on the back of that, that's seen growth for our organization and a stack of awards, which is great as well. It's all good validation.
Yeah, no. And I personally have also participated in one of your micro simulations. And
how did you find that?
Yeah, for me, it was a light bulb moment because, well, I mean, I was part of it, but I really enjoyed seeing the reaction of the crowd because we had a bigger crowd. And I felt it was very clear that these people are all professional, risk professionals, working on things like that every day. But all of them started to triangulate again. Wait a moment. We should also do this and involve this person and thinking alone thinking through the chain of command and who has to be part of the communication is already, I think, very important.
Yeah.
And then,
of course.
Yeah, I just loved it personally, and it took half an hour, and I feel everybody in the room got a lot of lessons learned. So I'm totally behind the concept, frankly.
Yeah.
And so that was my light bulb moment in London, by the way, beautiful scenery as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
But what were your standout stories with micro simulations? What happened where you say, okay, that was really, for me, also an experience that I haven't seen before, and I learned something personally as well?
Yeah, I think, we've had to iterate micro simulations somewhat since we originally started rolling them out. It's a couple of years now ago, funnily enough, and really trying to get focused on how much is too much and how much is not enough. So finding that sweet spot between cramming something into 30 minutes, but really getting to that aha moment, like that light bulb moment really quick. So that was a big lesson over the years in terms of crafting these. And so a huge amount of time has now gone into how do we create that light bulb moment? And that takes a lot of creativity, thought, takes a lot of triangulating against the market in terms of what threats are out there and what's going to challenge us. But I think my favorite reaction I've had from a very, very seasoned resilience practitioner he has really seen it all. I've got a lot of respect for this guy. He said to me after we ran the deepfake micro simulation, which is one that you've experienced as well, I hate that micro simulation. I absolutely hate it. And I'm like, what do you mean you hate the micro simulation? It's like, because I didn't think of it. And when you have like a resilience practitioner who has literally his whole life, 40 years in the profession, and he has literally seen it all, turn around and saying, I didn't even conceptualize our team being deep faked. It was a nice moment where you just realize that, again, everything we've seen before, there's still a lot of unknown unknowns and known unknowns that we haven't experienced yet. And so like the world is evolving, the threat landscape is evolving. And so you really still can challenge people to have those moments of very, very seasoned, experienced individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, sometimes it's very hard to get to the known unknowns as well, right? In an organization where maybe there is an idea in the business, but you just don't know about it on the risk executive level, right? So
Yeah.
do you also help them engage the business in maybe education, so they essentially also can provide that feedback a little bit better because they maybe understand more what the risk team is doing?
Yeah, absolutely. So, from that perspective, it is interesting where this is heading in that we are seeing risk practitioners and resilience practitioners pick up and use microsimulations for risk awareness campaigns. And it was funny, like the deepfake one's a great example of this, where we've had a, major, like one of the largest asset management companies in the Asia Pacific region come to me and saying, hey, we want to run a deepfake campaign right across their organization to actually start building up awareness across people, because they can be not just, I guess, exploited from a disinformation perspective, but also a fraud risk control perspective, right? Like we are seeing now losses happen where teams are being scammed out of money from deep fakes on Zoom calls and Teams calls. So yeah, we are seeing that evolution where risk practitioners are using it to create that awareness and that thought provoke right across the organization.
Yeah, great. So what are your top 3 microsimulations and why?
So, I mean, the deepfake one I do love just because it still gets a lot of aha moments. We've created a really interesting one that is stopping a lot of CISOs in their track at the moment, where we have a data breach situation in an open AI large language model. And so like that's a really challenging environment because no one knows how to extract like, company information, sensitive, be it legal documents, be it, personally identifiable, out of like these, like the dark side of open AI, not necessarily the chat GPTs, but the stuff that doesn't have privacy guardrails built in. And that's creating a lot of challenge for CISOs and giving them some thought around how do we manage that, and how do we manage that, I guess, across our organization. One of my favorite ones, absolute favorite ones, and I think you might have experienced this as well, Ulf, is we have a modern slavery third party micro simulation where we have a major critical vendor that's under a modern slavery expose. The board comes down and says they need to go, like we have to cut ties, and you have the business grappling with, well, what's the impact of that? And so you have this real challenging situation of business impact versus brand and reputation for teams to work through. So I just love the dynamic and the challenge that creates for a lot of management teams where they are considering business need against brand and reputation, challenge against their values from a modern slavery perspective. And it's fascinating always to watch that conversation go down and see how the teams essentially process and work through that.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a very tricky situation. Hopefully,
almost a wicked problem.
Yeah. I mean, in a perfect world, obviously, you don't cut ties and you help the supplier to evolve themselves, right? But
100%.
that
in a perfect world.
yeah, but how can you trust a supplier to begin with that they will improve, and how are you helping them develop probably with more money? And then the 100%. Question is it worth it? And so there's a lot that goes into that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
And I would hope that eventually we don't have that problem anymore.
Correct.
I want to point out real quick, a quick shout out to Slave Free Alliance and Hope for Justice, who are every day working on freeing forced people out of forced labor, enslaved labor, and child labor. Great organization. So if you're listening to the podcast, check them out. Good. So this is a supply chain podcast, so we also have to obviously take over that angle.
Of course.
And I know you have already worked with transportation and supply chain for a long time, but I do feel with iluminir, your conversations in the supply chain space got a lot more intense, and you have a lot more of those. So if you look at how did your impression when you started your career and you had no idea about supply chain to now change over time, and what specifically changed, that would be very interesting for listeners, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the for me, it's that understanding of not necessarily just the third party, but fourth and nth party exposure, and I guess the aggregate and concentration risk that sits behind third parties. That's probably been the really big wake up call. I mean, we spend a lot of time with organizations talking through and assessing what happens if we lose a third party. And then we start the conversation of what happens if there is a fourth party that impacts multiple third parties and what that means for the organization. And I think, I guess my first exposure to that was a long time ago, back in the Thailand floods, swept through from a manufacturing perspective. And again, the tsunami that hit, the earthquake and the tsunami, following tsunami that hit Japan, I guess the flow-on effects that we saw from that, not just from a third party perspective, but the entire supply chain being impacted in a multitude of ways, was a real wake-up call back then. And now what we're seeing, I guess that same translation happened from also a digital perspective. So it's not just the physical supply chain, but the digital supply chain and that ecosystem, and just how intertwined everything really is to get your head around. And again, to that point, some of that concentration risk exposure that sits with some of these major organizations, be it again, the physical supply chain, but also that digital supply chain, just in how reliant we are on them, the concentration risk that creates, and how organizations are trying to tackle that. And I think it's still very early days. We have a lot of conversations, a lot of, professionals in this space, but also at conferences. And there's not a lot of great answers around how to manage that, to be perfectly honest. So we're still problem solving for that. We're spending a lot of time on it with customers, but it's complex, certainly very complex.
Yeah. That was a deep answer, actually. That was super into the weeds. I didn't expect that, which shows me that you are talking about this way too much these days, okay?
Probably. It keeps me awake at night, to be honest.
Yeah, I can see that. I totally feel that, actually. Yeah, I mean, risk concentration is a big issue. And the sub-tier challenge, obviously, right? First you have to know, and then you have to manage it, and both is very complex. So I get that, and I've seen that and lived through that as well. So it's definitely a challenge for all organizations. And with the upcoming legislation, it's only getting more intense, right? So there will be requirements to know your sub-tiers and be able to manage them for forced human labor. And then you have the concentration risk and your scenario again, right? So if something happens,
100%.
How do you react?
Yeah, 100%. I think, and that is where we're spending a lot of time with organizations, is like, I mean, you can assess the risk all you want, but what does it actually look like when it materializes? And how does your business respond to that? And that is something you can start thinking about now, even if you don't understand, the nth degree of that risk from an impact perspective. You can start reverse engineering, and what does game day look like? Let's actually go through that, and how are we going to respond to that? And that, again, from a pragmatism perspective, it gets your team thinking about that before it happens. You can start thinking about how you might respond, the relationships you might need to have in place, the processes you might need to start thinking about, and the workarounds and contingency strategies that go with that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit behind the scenes of iluminir. You have a co-founder, right? And I know both of you, and you're a great duo coming from Australia. How do you feel? Was it important for you to co-found together? And does it make the experience of going through a high-intense startup better for you?
Yeah, I don't think I could do it without having a co-founder, especially a co-founder like Josh. it is, to your point, like startups are a lot of hard work. It is an intense journey. There are a lot of, yes, there are a lot of ups. There's a lot of hard grind and downs in between that. And it's an absolute roller coaster. And so, having a business partnership and a relationship, and, he's almost, like, to be perfectly honest, like extended family, to be perfectly honest. Like, we are that close, from a partnership perspective. And I don't think he could I don't think he can be as successful, without having, really, co-founders that will be in the trenches with you, through thick and thin. So Josh has absolutely been there with me, and vice versa, through thick and thin. And I wouldn't do it without having a strong co-founder, that's for sure. Because, like, as you know, building an organization is hard work from the get-go.
Yeah. And then I have a very Australian question. What are the pros and cons of launching a startup in Australia? Because
Oh my
I know
Lord.
you travel a lot, at least, right? That's
Yes.
probably a con.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a lot of cons, and time zone management is one of them, which we feel acutely right across the team. We've got customers in every continent around the world except for Antarctica. And if they're in Antarctica, they'd probably be the same time zone. So that'd be very helpful. So the time zone management is an absolute challenge. But I think one of the upsides of, building a startup in Australia is that you have to get very focused on the world, because Australia is a small market. And so if you just want to conquer Australia, that's great. You'll probably achieve that in a few years and move on. For us, we always took a global first approach, in that, resilience is required worldwide. And so I think, starting in Australia forced us to think beyond purely just Australian, regulations and requirements from a resiliency perspective, and really, like, think, outward looking in almost. And so that has helped us grow, in terms of, working with some of the largest organizations around the world in taking that global first view. So there are upsides to that. Aeroplane food is not one of those upsides. Yes, you do definitely travel a lot, but, as we've spoken about before, Rolf, it is also a journey. And I am naturally a traveler, so, that works well for me. And I do, whilst I don't love jet lag, I do enjoy, seeing the world on this journey, and meeting with customers all around the world, and hearing some of the challenges that they're facing, within their organization, but also in managing cultures around the world. Like, I think one of the big lessons we've had over the last couple of years is actually just the level of difference that there is between the Australian culture and something that we originally thought was actually very similar as the US culture. You actually spend a lot of time in the US and you realize they're actually very, very different cultures. Just as Australia is to Germany, very different cultures. So totally different ways of working. So that's been fascinating. So you certainly grow up with a global view, and that enriches your life.
Yeah. Actually, quick derailing, I've seen a very good movie that speaks to the different cultures in Germany and Australia. And it's called Kick It Like Zizou. And it's about a German football player called Mr. Broich, essentially. And I think he played in Australia for a long time, and I think he was called the Mozart of football there. And was, I think, player of the year a couple of times or something like that.
Yep.
And essentially, he was one of the biggest talents Germany had, but he never made it in Germany because of the culture that was there. And he needed a little bit of more liberty and freedom to grow. And then he went to Australia, and while he didn't earn as much money, he was so happy, and he never came back, essentially. So that was
fascinating.
A very interesting story. Yeah.
Oh, I'll have to get on top of that. That sounds fascinating.
That was a good story, actually. I really the storytelling was amazing, and it really essentially it was about football, which I'm not too much into football anymore these days, but it was more about happiness and finding the right environment to strive in, and that I really appreciated personally.
Yeah, nice.
Good. So now we have talked about risk and resilience, the short time you have to manage crises, educating people, but also being in a startup, all of that being very intense, frankly. So how do you personally cope with the madness? And yes, that's my hobby question I always ask at the end.
How do you cope with the madness? Yeah, I think my the two things that are dominating my life, and one's coping with the madness, and the other's probably creating a little bit of madness. The way I cope with the madness is trail running. So I love getting out into a trailhead out in the mountains. Putting 1 to 2 hours in. Pardon me, and yeah, really putting the body to the test in nature, and I love that. You get into waterfalls. Unfortunately, sometimes you get bitten by leeches. You're dodging snakes sometimes. Like the Australian outback is pretty testing and trying at times. But after 1 to 2 hours of running an undulating, grueling course, you come out dripping, but you come out on top of the world. And I think that that's a soul enriching experience for me. Certainly helps me manage the ups and downs that come with startup life. My other hobby is a little bit more nerdy than that. It's doing the deep dive into artificial intelligence regulation, because I just find it fascinating on how humans are writing policy, and it will be that hard stop between the existential threat of artificial intelligence over human intelligence. So that to me is just a very thought-provoking read, as nerdy as that is. Like I said, probably creates a bit more craziness than helps it.
Yeah. So while doing trial running, any big experiences that are shareable when it comes to animals haunting you? Any drop bears or
Drop bears? I love that. I mean, seen plenty of snakes. That's certainly one of it. But I had an experience just over last summer, a very wet summer in Australia, and some of the trail runs that I did, and I just was not prepared for this. And getting into waterfalls and creeks and rivers and streams, and just the amount of leeches that are out there at the moment. The person I was running with actually got bitten by a leech, pulled it off, and ended up with a bacterial infection from it. They had to go on antibiotics. It really quite a serious situation in the end, which has now been resolved. But it certainly woke me up to, I guess, the ups and downs that come with trail running, and just having to be a little bit more prepared than probably what I originally thought, to live through those experiences unhurt. But I've bitten the dust many a time, but I don't know, I still go back for more. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, no, that's cool. Good. And with that, we're at the end of this episode. So Marcus, I want to thank you so much for being here. That was an amazing interview. So thank you so much. I learned a lot.
Oh, thanks, Ulf. And I really appreciate it, and enjoy the opportunity to talk about the journey. Thank you.
Perfect. I love that. And with that, to all listeners and viewers, I want to just say, have a nice day wherever you are, and bye-bye.
This was Supply Chain Pioneers. Thanks for watching, listening, or however you are enjoying this podcast. You can find Supply Chain Pioneers on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all other major podcast players, as well as on YouTube at Ulf Talks Supply Chain. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. See you next time.